The Magician's Nephew is the first book in C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia, and it tells the story of the creation of Narnia by the great lion Aslan. And it tells the adventures of two children, Diggory and Polly, and it's situated at the end of the 19th century, and they travel across time and space to other worlds by means of magic rings made by an Uncle Andrew, who's arguably both mad and bad. At the beginning of the story, Diggory and his mum are looked after by an aunt, the sister of Andrew, because his mum is terminally ill and his father is away in India and presumably unaware of what was happening. Diggory, by his own foolishness and pride, awakens an evil witch and unwittingly brings her into Narnia at its beginning and is asked by Aslan to help undo some of the evil he has caused. Diggory has witnessed a little of the power of Aslan, and though tempted to make a bargain, realises that Aslan is not someone you make bargains with. But he agrees to help Aslan and take what it is, that he won't try and bargain with Aslan to have his mother healed. He will just do what Aslan has told him to do. And he feels things are extremely hopeless. And he speaks to Aslan like this. He says, "But please, please, can't you give something that will cure my mother?" Up till then, he had been looking at the lion's great feet and huge claws on them. Now, in his despair, he looked up at his face. What he saw surprised him as much as anything in his whole life, for the tawny face was bent down near his own, and, wonder of wonders, great shining tears stood in the lion's eyes. There were such bright, big tears compared with Diggory's own, that for a moment he felt that the lion must really be sorrier about his mother than he himself. my son," said Aslan, "I know, grief is great." And Aslan went on to help Diggory, and his mother was cured. But the point is that God is with us in our sufferings. God understands far better than we do the things that we go through. Now, as Mike has mentioned, that Rod, Mike and myself are going through the book of Mark. And it's really a book for our time because it's short, brief, and there is no waffle. Because nowadays I'm sure, all suffer from attention spans, particularly the younger of us. And we're finding we can't even watch movies anymore because we just don't have the attention span. So Mark is a great book for us. It's only 16 chapters. There's very little spare in there that you don't need to know, but the material there is carefully selected and ordered for a purpose. And the purpose, Mark has no secret about this, it is to tell us the gospel, the good news of Jesus Christ. It's not just a message, it's not just a lesson, he is telling us about a person, Jesus Christ. Now, Rod has mentioned before that we're so familiar nowadays with the Gospels, particularly in our culture, that we can overlook how incredible this message is. Imagine you were hearing this for the first time, that this book, this document is written to tell us about the most extraordinary person who ever lived, one who claimed to be the Son of God, who was in fact God himself, and as such demands not just our attention, but our obedience and our worship. This is what Mark was telling the first listeners, and he is still telling us today. And we've been over before, just to give you an idea of the structure of Mark, the first 8 chapters tell us about how Christ is revealing himself as the Messiah, as the Christ, so that by the end of the section, no fair-minded person would ever doubt that this was the Messiah, that Jesus was the Messiah. And then the remaining chapters, 9 to 16, he tells us of Jesus' message and his mission to defeat sin and evil via the cross. Something we perhaps don't think anything of, but in those cultures, in those times, it was so utterly horrific and shameful that as a death, Roman crucifixion was something that people despised, people thought people were evil or bad. It was such a shameful death, yet Mark is showing that through the suffering of Jesus and his death, he was going to bring in a new kingdom. Now, this morning we're going to cover 2 miracles, and they follow 2 other notable miracles which Rod covered recently. The first 2 show Jesus' power over nature and the powers of darkness. Remember Rod telling us about the disciples in the boat over the lake and the storm, and Jesus quelled the storm. And he also told us what was quite a disturbing story about Jesus' encounter with the demon-possessed man, the man who said his name was Legion. And so Jesus conquers two notable powers, the power of nature and the power of evil. What we're looking today is two more miracles, where they cover Jesus' power over sickness and death itself. Now, over the period when we've been covering Mark, we've encountered many miracles that Jesus has done. And we're all there to evidence his power and authority. But these four signs really top them all. They are like nothing else that we've heard before. And yet, these miracles show something more about Jesus than some kind of arbitrary power. Rod and Mike have in their sermons indicated that the miracles are more than just Jesus doing amazing things because he could, or even to show others that he could. So there are other factors in play. Sure, they are to show us that Jesus is the Son of God, that they give credence and evidence of his power and who he says he was. They are part of his self-disclosure of his messiahship. But strangely, he doesn't disclose himself to everybody. He could have done, but he only discloses himself to those with faith, to a select few. And often their faith is imperfect, it's deficient, but nonetheless, Jesus shows himself, he shows these signs to them to encourage them and to foster and perfect their faith. But there's something else, and Rod has mentioned this, that they are to demonstrate the character of Jesus in his love and compassion. This is not just a mighty warrior, this is not just a king, but this is someone who is bowed down to this earth to come close to us, to empathise with us and to sympathise with us in our own needs and our own trials. We see a man so different from the great of this world that we don't see anyone like him in the world today or ever have done before. There's a quote which Rod's used before by Lord Acton. It says, "Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely." But this isn't true with Jesus. This was someone who had absolute power, yet he was untainted, he was pure, he was full of love and compassion for others. So today we're going to look at the passage which Mike's just read. It's a passage which is pretty familiar. In fact, Martin spoke about it fairly recently, and so you're welcome to listen to it's on the Pontesbury website. It was spoken on an evening, and so perhaps if you want a better take on it, you can listen to that. But it's easy to feel this because it's a passage which I'm sure if you've been to Sunday school or been literate in Christian things, you may have heard many, many times before. And it's a bit like when Mike did the parable of the sower. It's a sort of passage which you think, well, everyone has heard this so many times. What exactly am I going to say which no one doesn't already know or feel that actually is new to them? But it is true that in Jesus we see something completely different. At the end of the day, knowing who our Lord Jesus is not simply knowing about his great power and about his authority over our lives, but it is in submitting to him. It is not simply about hearing of him, but it is about believing in him and trusting in his love, his understanding and compassion for us in all aspects of our lives. These are things we cannot know and grasp too well, and neither can our faith be too strong, and it cannot be in any other person. Now, something I just share, something which I've never read, but you probably all know anyway. Going through the book of Mark, and I've noticed it in my reading of it, there are records with compassion and empathy. He records things where he's almost alongside that person. It's almost he knows where they're coming from. He does it in a way that you don't see in Matthew and Luke. It's almost like this is a person who says, I know where they're at. He understands people's doubts. He understands the weakness of faith. And when we look at Mark's life, we perhaps might have some inkling that some of the things that happened to him, for instance, at the end of Mark, we believe that the young man who runs away into the darkness when the men come to arrest Jesus was Mark himself. This is someone who fled when Jesus was in his great need. And that must have haunted him for the rest of his life. We also know that Mark abandoned St. Paul and Barnabas, his uncle, when they were halfway through a missionary journey. And Paul actually was not very happy about that. And again, he got over this, but he recognized that when you look at people's faults, you just have to look at yourself. But perhaps his own life had taught him humility and enabled him to empathize with people in situations that he narrated. So back to our passage. The passage and the narrative is simple enough. There are in fact two stories here intertwined. We have a woman with an affliction that she's endured for 12 years, and a sick child who, curiously, was born when the woman became ill. Both of their cases are, humanly speaking, hopeless, but Jesus' intervention brings healing to them both, but in his own way and his own time. Both the father of the girl and the woman herself show faith, and Jesus used these incidents to perfect their faith, because it is obvious from the beginning that their faith is not mature and it's not complete. And he does this so they would know and believe in the living Christ. So we start our passage, and I'll read verse by verse and have some explanation to it. When Jesus had again crossed over by boat to the other side of the lake, a large crowd gathered around him while he was by the lake. Then one of the synagogue leaders named Jairus came. When he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet. He pleaded earnestly with him, "My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her, so that she will be healed and live." So Jesus went with him. When Rod finished last time, Jesus and his disciples were leaving the region of Decapolis on the eastern side of Lake Galilee. And here we see that Jesus has returned to Jewish territory. There's a large crowd has gathered. It makes it as though that the crowd was gathering, but it may have already started to gather before Jesus' boat got there. And the large crowd indicates a recurring theme that Jesus was popular. He was very popular. But Mark doesn't always look at this in a good light, because these crowds of people, they listened to his cheap teaching. They were objects of his compassion, but they were passive. They didn't really care. They didn't repent. They were fickle with respect to Jesus' teaching on the cost of discipleship. And so they weren't viewed by Mark as a great sign. In fact, often they got in the way of his ministry. But right there, almost before Jesus is off the boat, there is a man waiting for him. Jairus, a man in anguish and desperate need. As we read, he was the leader of the synagogue, one of the committee of ruling elders, and therefore has some standing in the town. Now, just a side issue, what were synagogues? Because in the Old Testament, we don't read much about them, but they were an institution which grew up after the destruction of the temple, during the Babylonian exile. And they actually happened when the temple was rebuilt. They carried on hand in hand with the temple worship, but they were local places in the communities where people would worship and be instructed. The word itself, synagogue, is Greek, meaning assembly. Jairus is helpless in the face of his daughter's illness. His heart is breaking. In Luke, she's mentioned as his only daughter, and it makes that incident so poignant, and it explains why he's so desperate. He falls at Jesus' feet, begging for his help. Now, it wasn't uncommon in those days for a rabbi to come and lay hands on a person who was sick. But what is unusual in this case is the confidence that Jairus has that Jesus would come and she would be healed. And so Jesus, without delay and without a moment of delay, leaves. Now, that little girl was probably one of the most insignificant people in the town. No one had ever heard of her. But Jesus, without any delay, leaves what he's doing, what he's planned to do, and is straight off to her house. A large crowd followed and pressed around him, and a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had. Yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, because she thought, if I just touch his clothes, I will be healed. Immediately, her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. So with that huge crowd which had gathered around them, going was slow. And you can imagine for Jairus, every second that went by, he was getting more and more anxious because his faith wasn't that great. He was assuming if only Jesus could get there in time, if only he could get there in time, she would be healed. He didn't know what would happen if she died. And he didn't have the faith at that point to know what to do. And then there was a delay. Suddenly Jesus stops and makes a strange announcement that despite the jostling crowd, someone had touched him. And in that crowd was a woman who had suffered what is described as a flow of blood for 12 years. And it's often assumed that it was some kind of chronic hemorrhaging from the womb. But from Mark's account, we don't really know. But we do know this: the woman was in poverty because she'd spent all her money in a desperate attempt to get better. And when we hear the kind of treatments that they kind of had, we're not really very surprising. For example, drink a goblet of wine containing a powder made of rubber, alum and garden crocuses. Or take a dose of Persian onions cooked in wine with a summons arise of your flow of blood. Or even carrying the ash of an ostrich egg in a certain cloth. And it's probably not very surprising that she didn't get better. But that didn't help her. It isn't hard to imagine a state. She is poor, she is ritually unclean, and separated from society. And really, she shouldn't even have been in that crowd. She's a woman and completely alone. And so what's the problem about being a woman? There was a rabbi who was quite commonly said in those days that the men would say they thank God that they weren't made a Gentile, a slave, or a woman. And if you think that is bad, actually even today in Jewish worship, one of the prayers is, "Blessed are you," this is what men say, "Blessed are you, Lord our God, ruler of the universe, who has not created me a woman." And that is spoken today in certain Jewish congregations. Now, she knows Jesus as a healer with power, and her desire to touch him combines a weak faith with some kind of quasi-magical notions which were common in that day, that the power of the person could be transferred by simply touching what he wears. But despite perhaps her confused ideas, she believed, and she was healed immediately and knew it. At once, Jesus realized the power had gone out from him. He turned round in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my clothes?" "You see the crowd crowding around you," his disciples answered, "and yet you can ask, 'Who touched me?'" Now, Jesus knew immediately what had happened. However, the phrase, "power has gone out," is a bit strange, and it only occurs here in the Gospels. How was she healed? The scene reveals the convergence of the human and divine natures of the person of Christ. The woman is healed by the supernatural power that Jesus has. And he was aware that the desperate touch of the woman in the middle of the pressing crowd was effectual. It was her faith that had healed her. But she needs to understand what has happened and why it happened. She could have gone away and slunk away, and she would have been none the wiser. She would have still persisted the idea that she had done something and the magic had worked. But she needed more. And Jesus kept looking round to see who had done it. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, trembling with fear, told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." Now, Jesus is searching for the person he had healed, and in doing so, he provides her opportunity to come forward and confess what has happened, but also so that she understands that it was her faith, and it was her faith alone in him that had made this happen. And by doing this, when Jesus will speak to her, she will understand fully how it is and who Jesus is. And she confesses, perhaps with a guilty conscience, that she has taken something that was not hers to take. But there's no reprimand from Jesus, no grudging sharp word, no question of why did you think you do this? What did you think? What righted you to do this? He calls her daughter, a term of affection. She is a child of God's kingdom. And nowhere else in any of the Gospels is any woman referred to by Jesus as daughter. Again, as I said at the beginning, Mark has this empathy and his care and his compassion for people. And he sends her on her way with his warmest blessing. While Jesus was still speaking, some people came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue leader. "Your daughter is dead. Why bother the teacher anymore?" Overhearing what they said, Jesus told him, "Don't be afraid, just believe." So, meanwhile, in the delay, Jairus received the devastating news from home that his daughter had died, and so, presumably beyond any help that Jesus can give. The news wasn't spoken directly to Jesus, but he overhears and he ignores it. For Jairus, he perhaps believed that Jesus could have healed his daughter while she was still alive, but now everything is lost. Jesus knows his fear and he knows his anxiety and says two things. Do not be afraid, believe. Jairus, I know you are afraid. Put away your fear. I know you believe. Keep on believing. I will not let you down. He draws Jairus from a faith which was perhaps could have been just a healing, but to something which was truly outstanding. Something which at the beginning Jairus wouldn't have had the faith to believe in that, but Jesus calls him to greater faith. He did not let anyone follow him except Peter, James and John, the brother of James. And when they came to the house of the synagogue leader, Jesus saw a commotion with people crying and wailing loudly. He went in and said to them, "Why all this commotion and wailing? The child is not dead, but asleep." But they laughed at him. Throughout Mark, we've seen how Jesus doesn't reveal himself to everybody, and he chooses how and when and to whom to disclose himself. The mourners were probably paid. They were playing flutes, singing dirges, and that's what happened in deaths and in funeral occasions at the time. And they really demonstrated what they really thought and who they were by their reaction to what Jesus said. They displayed their total lack of faith by their mockery, and so that they never were allowed to witness what the disciples and the parents of the child did. So, after Jesus had kicked them out, he took the child's father and mother and the disciples and went to where the child was. And he took her by the hand and said, "Talitha kum," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, get up." Immediately the girl stood up and began to walk around. She was 12 years old. At this they were completely astonished. He gave strict orders not to let anyone know about this and told them to give her something to eat. So Jesus has taken charge of the situation. He got rid of the mockers from the house, and they were mockers and mourners. And then with a single touch and command, no lengthy prayer, no incantations, no ritual, with one word, he heals her from the dead. Now, it's interesting here, Mark uses the word Aramaic for the Talitha kum. It's not Greek, it's not Hebrew, it's Aramaic. Aramaic was the language which the common people spoke in Israel. It's closely related to Hebrew, and which was used by the religious establishment and the upper class. The word Talitha means lamb. It's a pet name for children. So why did Mark record this? Not because it was a magic formula, but it was not just simply an act of his authority. It demonstrates, again, his compassion and his care for that child, for children. And he witnessed this in a very practical way to tell the parents to give her some food. Now, Mike mentioned, at the beginning, at some point, everybody would have to know about this, and that is indeed true. Sooner or later, they would see the child walking around and realize that she was alive again. But the reason why Jesus said not to tell anyone was he did not want it revealed at that moment. It gave him a chance to get away. He didn't want the fame of unbelieving people. He didn't want the plaudits of crowds. He wanted the worship only of those who trusted him. So, what can we learn from this passage for us? We see again what Mark has been telling us again and again, that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. He has the authority of the Son of God. He is Lord of all. He has power over all, whether evil in its most powerful form, nature itself, sickness, and even death. But there is no halfway on this. You can't have a half Jesus or a half Christ or a half Son of God. You either have him as he is, you accept him for that as he discloses himself, or you reject him. The passage also tells us about faith. We see Jairus and the sick lady recognizing they could not save themselves, but expressing their full dependence on God's saving power. And we also see the growth in their faith. We tend to think of faith as something you have or you haven't, and that's it. It's just pretty straightforward and binary. But our faith doesn't have to stay in one place. It can grow. Our faith can grow into deeper trust and deeper confidence in the Lord. And when that happens, our prayers will become stronger, they will become more effective, and we will, in a virtuous circle, become more trusting ourselves. So Jesus used their circumstances, which were quite difficult circumstances, to perfect their faith. And I think we could all agree that whether Jairus or the lady, their circumstances were pretty desperate and difficult. He used those circumstances to increase their faith and to perfect it. And I'm sure we all experience situations and trials that we would rather, frankly, not go through. And they're not simply for us to endure and put up with, but they're often sent to try our faith and increase our trust in him. And the third point is the compassion of Jesus. Sometimes we can lurch from one end to the other. We can end up with a Christ who is powerful, a God who is overall, a God who is strong and creator. He holds the whole world in his hands. But we forget that he's got something to do with us. He is someone who actually, despite his power, despite his greatness, despite what he does, he has compassion for us and he has love for us. In this episode, those two people, the only two people we hear on that day who had anything done for them by Jesus, and they could arguably two most insignificant people in that village. By her illness, her gender, and lack of money, the woman would have had little authority or little value to the society of the day. And the same for the young child. Children really weren't thought much of in those days. She wasn't even out of her childhood. She was a child and a female and thought nothing of in the social order. But to Jesus, they were both worthy of his undivided attention. And I think this can affect us in two ways. However insignificant or unworthy we may feel about ourselves, we are precious in the sight of Christ. But also, as followers of Jesus, we are called to treat all people, whatever their status or position, with respect and compassion. And not just people in general, people here, people in Pontesbury Baptist Church. That is no more true than in this congregation here. We must treat everyone with respect and compassion and love. I'd like to finish with a note about faith. I'm not going to say anything new, something we didn't know already, but it's vital that we do know this. Faith is trusting in Jesus no matter how bad the circumstances appear to be or even what our feelings are. If we are truly the Lord's, we will experience trials, there's no doubt about it, and they are there, sent there to test our faith and designed to increase our trust in Jesus. Faith actually isn't a supreme superpower. Some people have an idea that it's by our willpower, and it's the same as faith, but faith is not willpower. Faith is abandoning our trust in ourselves. Faith is looking to somebody else, and it's having confidence in the one who controls every circumstances. And in doing so, we can be sure that he will look after us. We can trust him. We can rely on him. And we can be sure that no matter how hard and how difficult we are finding things, he is there with us and for us. He understands everything about our circumstances, and his love and compassion are always there. sometimes prayers aren't actually answered in the way we want them to be. There's a poem, a hymn written by John Newton, and it's a favourite of mine and my wife's. And it's just showing sometimes we have to expect that our prayers won't be quite answered in the way we think. It was almost semi-autobiographical. John Newton was the one who wrote Amazing Grace. He had a very colourful life in his youth. But he wrote this: "I asked the Lord that I might grow in faith and love and in every grace, might more of his salvation know, and seek more earnestly his face. 'Twas he who taught me thus to pray, and he, I trust, has answered prayer. But it has been in such a way as almost drove me to despair. I hoped that in some favoured hour at once he'd answer my request, and by his love constraining power subdue my sins and give me rest. Instead of this, he made me feel the hidden evils of my heart, and let the angry powers of hell assault my soul in every part. Yea, more with his own hand it seemed, intent to aggravate my woe, crossed all the fair designs I schemed, blasted my girds and laid me low. Lord, why is this? I trembling cried. Wilt thou pursue thy worm to death? 'Tis in this way, the Lord replied, I answer prayer for grace and faith. These inward trials I employ, from self and pride to set thee free, and break thy schemes of earthly joy, that thou mayest find thy all in me.